Boy discovers hidden room in backyard. What he finds changes everything. Lucas wiped the sweat from his forehead as he dug into the soft earth beneath the old oak tree. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, creating dancing shadows on the ground where he worked. His mom's flower bed stretched out behind him, full of bright colors that always made their backyard look like something from a magazine cover. The smell of fresh dirt filled his nose as he searched for worms to add to his dad's compost bin. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. The shovel wasn't really his. It was a garden spade he'd borrowed from his mom's tool collection. He'd promised to put it back exactly where he found it, just like always. Lucas had gotten pretty good at finding worms over the past few months. His dad had taught him that the best ones usually hung out near the tree roots where the soil stayed nice and damp. The peaceful Saturday stretched out ahead of him with no homework to worry about and no chores left to do. The only sounds were the birds chattering in the trees and the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. Lucas loved these quiet afternoons in their yard, especially the part that backed up to the small patch of woods. Sometimes he'd spot rabbits or even deer passing through the trees. He was just about to call it quits for the day when his shovel hit something that definitely wasn't a rock. The sound was different, more like metal hitting metal. The noise made his hands tingle a bit from the vibration. Lucas froze, his heart suddenly beating a little faster. "What the?" he muttered, scraping away more dirt with the edge of the spade. Something was gleaming under there, just barely visible through the dark soil. He dropped to his knees, not caring about the grass stains his mom would probably scold him about later, and started brushing away dirt with his hands. A metal handle emerged from the earth, its surface dulled by rust, but still solid underneath. Lucas grabbed it and gave an experimental tug, but it didn't budge. His mind started racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a treasure chest, like in those movies he loved watching. Or maybe it was something even cooler, a time capsule or a secret military bunker. He sat back on his heels, staring at his discovery. The handle was attached to what looked like a trapdoor, or hatch of some kind. It was too heavy for him to lift with just his hands, that much was clear. But his dad's toolbox in the garage had all sorts of useful things that might help. Lucas jumped to his feet, excitement making him forget all about the worms he'd been hunting. The short run to the garage felt like it took forever. He could barely contain himself as he grabbed the red metal toolbox, its contents rattling as he hurried back to his discovery. Dropping back down by the handle, he pulled out a crowbar, the same one his dad had used last summer when they built the treehouse together. Lucas wedged the crowbar under the edge of what he could now see was definitely a hatch. He pushed down with all his weight, just like his dad had shown him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound that made him jump, the hatch shifted slightly. "Emily," he shouted toward the house, hoping his sister would hear him through her bedroom window. "Emily, come check this out." He heard the back door slam and footsteps rushing across the yard. His 15-year-old sister appeared beside him, her phone still in her hand. "What's up, Squirt? This better be good. I was in the middle of..." Her voice trailed off as she saw the partially exposed hatch. "What is that?" "Help me open it," Lucas said, already positioning the crowbar for another try. Emily tucked her phone into her pocket and grabbed the metal handle. Together, they pulled and pushed until, with a loud creak, the hatch swung open. Cool air wafted up from the dark opening below. Lucas and Emily leaned forward, peering down into the darkness. A metal ladder disappeared into the shadows, its rungs looking sturdy despite their age. The opening was about 3 feet wide, plenty big enough for them to fit through. "We should probably tell Mom and Dad," Emily said, but Lucas could hear the excitement in her voice. She wanted to explore just as much as he did. "They won't be back from the grocery store for at least an hour," Lucas pointed out. He was already running through a mental checklist of what they'd need. "I know where Dad keeps his big flashlight." Emily bit her lip, looking between the house and the hatch. "If we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. We should get some rope too, just in case. And you're not going down there alone." Lucas nodded quickly, willing to agree to anything as long as they could explore before their parents got home. They gathered their supplies: the flashlight, some rope from the garage, and Emily's phone with its fully charged battery. Standing at the edge of the opening again, Lucas felt his stomach flutter with a mix of nervousness and excitement. The metal ladder looked solid enough, but Emily insisted on testing each rung before Lucas started climbing down. The cooler air rising from below carried a musty smell, like old books and damp earth. Lucas took a deep breath, clicked on the flashlight, and started his descent into the darkness. Each step down the ladder felt like stepping further into another world. The sunlight from above grew dimmer, and the beam of his flashlight became their main source of light. The walls around them were made of stone, with patches of moss growing in the dampest spots. Lucas could hear Emily following him down, her breathing steady but quick with excitement. "Be careful," she whispered, though there was no real reason to be quiet. Maybe it was just that kind of moment, the type where you naturally lower your voice, like in a library or a church. The ladder seemed to go on forever, though Lucas later figured it couldn't have been more than 15 feet down. His flashlight beam bounced off the damp walls, creating weird shadows that made his heart beat faster. The air got cooler with each step, and that musty smell grew stronger. "You okay down there?" Emily called from above, her voice echoing slightly in the narrow space. "Yeah," Lucas answered, trying to sound braver than he felt. "I think I'm almost at the bottom." His foot finally touched solid ground instead of another metal rung. He swept the flashlight beam around, revealing a room about the size of his bedroom. The walls were made of fitted stone blocks, like something from a castle, with strange markings carved into them. Some looked like letters from an alphabet he'd never seen before, while others seemed more like pictures. "There's definitely something down here," he called up to Emily, who was still making her way down. "It's like a secret room or something." The beam of his flashlight caught something in the corner that made him catch his breath. A wooden chest, about as big as their TV, sat against the far wall. It looked ancient, with metal bands around it that had turned green with age. The wood was dark and rough, like it had been sitting there for hundreds of years. Emily reached the bottom and pulled out her phone, using its flashlight to add more light to the room. "This is insane," she whispered, running her hand along one of the carved walls. "Look at all these symbols. They must mean something." Lucas was already moving toward the chest, drawn to it like a magnet. The lid was heavy-looking, with a thick padlock holding it shut. The lock was old, like everything else down here, but it looked solid. He gave it a gentle tug just to check. "No way we're getting that open without tools," Emily said, coming to stand beside him. She took a picture of the chest with her phone. "Maybe we should come back with Dad's bolt cutters." Lucas nodded reluctantly. As much as he wanted to know what was inside, he knew they'd need help. Plus, the air down here was starting to feel a bit thick, and he noticed Emily checking the time on her phone more than once. "Let's get a few more pictures before we go up," Emily suggested, already moving around the room to capture the wall carvings. The flash from her phone made the symbols stand out sharply against the stone. Nobody's going to believe this without proof. Lucas made one more circuit of the room, shining his light into every corner. Besides the chest, there wasn't much else to see, just the carved walls and a few small niches that might have once held torches or lamps. But something about the room felt important, like they'd stumbled onto something bigger than just a weird hole in their backyard. Getting back up the ladder was harder than going down. Their arms were tired, and the excitement of discovery was wearing off, replaced by a growing awareness of how strange and potentially dangerous their situation was. What if the ladder broke? What if the hatch somehow swung shut while they were down there? Emily went up first, with Lucas following close behind. The sunlight streaming through the opening seemed impossibly bright after the darkness below. They had to help each other climb out, their shoes slipping a bit on the metal rungs near the top. Once they were both safely back on grass, they sat for a moment, catching their breath and looking at each other with matching grins. Their clothes were dirty, and Lucas had cobwebs in his hair, but neither of them cared. "We need a plan," Emily said, scrolling through the pictures on her phone. "Mom and Dad will be home soon, and we have to figure out how to tell them about this." Lucas nodded, his mind already racing ahead to what might be in that chest. "Maybe we could show Dad first? He's less likely to freak out than Mom." "Good point," Emily agreed. "Plus, he's got all those tools in the garage. He'll probably know how to open the chest without breaking it." They spent the next few minutes carefully closing the hatch and covering it with loose dirt and leaves. Not enough to hide it completely, they'd need to show their parents where it was, but enough to make sure nobody else would stumble across it by accident. As they walked back to the house, Lucas couldn't stop thinking about the chest and those strange symbols. He'd read enough books and watched enough movies to know that finding a secret underground room wasn't an everyday occurrence. This was something special, something that might change everything. Emily must have been thinking the same thing because she stopped at the back door and turned to him with a serious look. "Whatever's down there," she said, "it's our discovery. We found it together." Lucas nodded solemnly, understanding what she meant. No matter what happened next, this would always be their secret first, something that bonded them as siblings in a way that nothing else had before. They could hear their parents' car pulling into the driveway out front. Lucas and Emily shared one more excited look before heading inside to clean up. They had a lot of explaining to do, but first, they needed to figure out exactly how to tell their parents they'd found what might be the biggest discovery of their lives, right in their own backyard. Lucas barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those weird symbols on the walls and that mysterious chest just sitting there, waiting to be opened. He kept checking his phone, texting Emily in the next room about different theories of what might be inside. Their parents' reaction had been surprisingly calm. Dad had gone down to check it out himself, using his heavy-duty flashlight and taking pictures of everything. Mom had been worried at first, especially about them climbing down there alone, but her concern quickly turned to curiosity when she saw the photos. "This kind of stonework hasn't been used around here for at least 100 years, Dad had said, examining the walls. "Someone put a lot of work into building this." They'd agreed to wait until morning to try opening the chest. Dad wanted better lighting and his full set of tools from the garage. Plus, Mom insisted they all get a good night's sleep first, though Lucas knew that wasn't going to happen, at least not for him. When the sun finally came up, Lucas was already dressed and waiting in the kitchen. Emily joined him a few minutes later, looking like she hadn't slept much either. They ate breakfast quickly, barely tasting their cereal as they waited for their parents to get ready. The morning air was cool and damp as they all walked out to the hatch. Dad carried his big toolbox, and Mom brought a camping lantern she'd found in the basement. This time, they set up a proper system with ropes and better lighting before anyone went down. "Okay," Dad said, examining the padlock on the chest. "This is old, but it's not anything special. Should be able to get it open without damaging it too much." He worked carefully with his tools while the rest of them held lights and watched. The lock finally gave way, with a loud click that echoed in the small room. Lucas felt his heart racing as Dad lifted the heavy lid. The smell of old paper and leather filled the air. Inside the chest, stacked neatly, were dozens of leather-bound notebooks. They looked ancient, their pages yellow with age, but they were surprisingly well-preserved. "These must have been sealed up tight," Mom said, carefully lifting out one of the notebooks. "Look at the handwriting. It's beautiful." They brought the notebooks up to the surface, spreading them out on a blanket in the grass. Each one was filled with detailed writing, drawings, and maps. Some pages had pressed flowers or leaves between them, while others contained sketches of buildings and artifacts that none of them recognized. Emily started reading from one of the notebooks, her voice growing more excited with each sentence. "Listen to this. The artifacts recovered from the eastern site suggest a settlement far older than any previously documented in this region. I've taken the liberty of securing the most significant pieces in my private collection, as I fear the university would not understand their true importance." "There's more," Lucas said, flipping through another book. "Look at these maps. They're of our town, but everything looks different. And these X marks, they're all over the place." Dad picked up one of the older-looking notebooks and started reading carefully. "These belong to Theodore Fleming," he said after a while. "I've heard that name before. He was a local historian back in the late 1800s. He lived in this house." Mom looked up from her own notebook. "It says here he traveled all over the world collecting artifacts and studying ancient civilizations. But he was especially interested in the history of this area. He believed there was something important hidden here, something that went back way before the first European settlers." They spent hours going through the notebooks, piecing together the story. Theodore Fleming had been more than just a historian. He'd been an explorer and collector who'd made some kind of major discovery. But instead of sharing it with the world, he'd hidden it away, leaving these notebooks as a guide for someone to find later. "Look at this family tree," Emily said, pointing to a carefully drawn diagram. "It shows all the owners of this house, right up until about 50 years ago. And there are notes beside each name, like he was keeping track of something." Lucas found himself drawn to the pages that mentioned their property. Fleming had written detailed descriptions of the underground chamber, calling it his sanctuary. He'd also mapped out other locations around their yard and the woods behind it, marking them with symbols that matched some of the ones carved on the walls below. "He writes about something called the Keystone over and over," Mom said, showing them a page filled with complex drawings. Whatever it was, he thought it was incredibly important. He calls it the key to understanding everything. The more they read, the more questions they had. Fleming's notes hinted at discoveries that could change history, but he'd been careful never to write down exactly what he'd found. Instead, he'd left a trail of clues and riddles, almost like he was creating a treasure hunt for whoever found his notebooks. As the sun started to set, they carefully gathered up the notebooks and took them inside. The dining room table disappeared under stacks of leather-bound books as they tried to organize everything they'd found. Lucas couldn't believe that all this had been sitting under their yard for so long, just waiting to be discovered. "We need to be careful with this information," Dad said, looking thoughtfully at the piles of notebooks. "Fleming went to a lot of trouble to keep these things hidden. There must have been a reason." Mom nodded in agreement. "We should take our time, try to understand everything before we decide what to do next. These notebooks, they're not just about history. They're about a mystery that's been waiting over 100 years to be solved." Lucas looked at Emily, seeing his own excitement mirrored in her eyes. They both knew this was just the beginning. The real adventure would be figuring out what Fleming had discovered and why he'd gone to such lengths to hide it. The next few days felt like living in a dream. Lucas and Emily spent every free moment poring over Fleming's notebooks, trying to make sense of his cryptic notes and detailed drawings. They spread everything out on the living room floor, arranging the books by date and creating their own index of important information. "Look at this," Lucas said, pointing to a sketch that showed their backyard. He marked the old oak tree, but the drawing shows something else too. These stones arranged in a pattern around it. "Think they're still theirs?" Emily leaned in closer, comparing the sketch to other drawings they'd found. "They might be buried by now. This was written over 100 years ago. But maybe we could find them with Dad's metal detector?" Their father had taken a few days off work to help them investigate, though he insisted they approach everything systematically. He'd started making copies of the most important pages, worried that the old paper might fall apart if they handled it too much. Fleming was definitely looking for something specific, Dad said, reviewing his copies. "These notes about the Keystone keep mentioning patterns in plain sight and marks left by the ancient ones." He seemed to think this whole area was some kind of massive puzzle. Mom had gotten involved too, using her experience as a librarian to research Theodore Fleming's background. She'd found old newspaper articles about him, mostly dismissive pieces that painted him as an eccentric who made wild claims about the region's history. "No wonder he kept everything secret," she said, showing them a particularly harsh article from 1892. Nobody believed him when he tried to share his discoveries. They thought he was making it all up. But Fleming's notebooks told a different story. The detailed drawings, careful measurements, and precise descriptions spoke of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He'd created a series of connected clues, each one leading to the next, all somehow tied to this mysterious keystone. Lucas and Emily started in their own backyard, armed with their dad's metal detector and their phones loaded with pictures of Fleming sketches. They worked in a spiral pattern out from the old oak tree, marking anything that seemed unusual. Their first real discovery came on a Tuesday afternoon. The metal detector started beeping near a cluster of rocks that looked perfectly natural, but matched one of Fleming's drawings exactly. Carefully digging around the rocks, they found a small metal box containing an ancient-looking coin and what appeared to be an arrowhead. "There's writing on the box," Emily said, cleaning off the dirt with her shirt sleeve. The letters were worn but still readable, matching symbols they'd seen in the underground chamber. Each discovery led to another. They found more boxes hidden around their property, some containing similar artifacts, others holding pieces of what looked like a map. Fleming had been clever about his hiding spots, using natural landmarks that wouldn't change much over time. He must have spent years setting all this up, Dad said, helping them document each find with photographs. These aren't random hiding places. They all connect to each other somehow. The biggest breakthrough came when they found a larger iron box embedded in the roots of an old tree at the edge of their property. Inside were two items that made Lucas's heart race: a strange compass that didn't point north and an ornate key covered in familiar symbols. The compass is pointing at the underground chamber, Emily realized, watching the needles swing steadily toward their backyard. And look at these symbols on the key. They match the ones we found on the walls down there. Mom examined the key carefully. Fleming mentions a key in his later notebooks, but he never says exactly what it opens. He writes about a final chamber and something about the truth hiding in plain sight. The discovery energized their search. Lucas and Emily spent hours comparing the symbols on the key to their copies of the wall carvings, convinced they were missing something obvious. The compass seemed to be more than just a direction finder. Its face was marked with additional symbols that appeared in Fleming's notebooks. What if the compass isn't just pointing at the chamber? Lucas suggested one evening. What if it's trying to show us something specific inside it? Emily sat up straighter, grabbing one of the notebooks. Remember that weird pattern on the far wall? The one that looked kind of like a star? What if that's not just decoration? Their parents agreed to another expedition into the underground chamber, this time with better equipment and a clear purpose. They'd studied Fleming's notes more carefully and noticed he often mentioned the importance of proper alignment and timing. He was big on astronomical alignments, Dad said as they prepared to go down. Lots of his notes talk about the position of the sun and stars. Maybe that's part of the puzzle too. Lucas felt different going down the ladder this time. The chamber wasn't just a mysterious room anymore. It was part of something bigger, something that Fleming had spent his life trying to protect and preserve. Every symbol on the walls, every carefully placed stone, might be part of the message he'd left behind. The key they'd found seemed to hum with possibility in Lucas's pocket. Whatever they were about to discover, he knew it would change everything. Fleming's legacy was finally about to be revealed, over a century after he'd hidden it away, waiting for someone to solve his puzzle. The chamber felt different this time. Maybe it was all the new lighting they'd brought down, or maybe it was just that they knew so much more now. Dad had set up a work light in the corner, casting bright illumination across the ancient stones. The walls seemed to come alive under the strong light, the carvings casting sharp shadows that made patterns they hadn't noticed before. The symbols aren't random, Emily said, comparing them to the pages they'd brought down from Fleming's notebooks. Look, they're telling a story just like he wrote about. Each section connects to the next. Lucas stood in the center of the room, holding the strange compass they'd found. The needle swung steadily, pointing not at the walls but at something else, a spot just above eye level where several carved lines intersected. "Dad, can you shine a light here?" he asked, pointing to the spot. Under the direct beam, they could see a small depression in the stone, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. Emily walked over, running her fingers along the carved lines. These match the patterns on the key's handle. And look at how they spiral out from this point, just like in Fleming's drawings. Their father examined the spot carefully, measuring the depression with a small ruler. "The key should fit perfectly," he said, looking at Lucas. "Want to do the honors? You're the one who found the hatch in the first place." Lucas pulled the key from his pocket, feeling its weight in his hand. The metal was warm, almost like it was alive. He lined it up with the depression, matching the patterns like Fleming's notebooks had shown. The key slid in smoothly, as if it had been waiting for them. "Turn it clockwise," Emily said, reading from one of the notebooks. Fleming wrote that the sun rises in the east, and so too must the key turn. Lucas took a deep breath and turned the key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then they heard a faint click from inside the wall, followed by a grinding sound that made them all step back. A section of the wall shifted inward slightly, revealing a hidden compartment about the size of a shoebox. Inside, Nestled on a bed of aged fabric lay a stone unlike anything they'd ever seen. It was roughly oval-shaped, about as big as Lucas's hand, and covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change in the light. "The keystone," Emily whispered, her voice full of awe. "We actually found it." Dad helped Lucas carefully lift the stone from its hiding place. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and the surface was warm to the touch, just like the key had been. The carvings wrapped around it in spiraling patterns, similar to the ones on the chamber walls, but more detailed, more precise. "Look at how the lines flow," Mom said, pointing to where one pattern merged into another. "They're not just decorative, they're like a map or a diagram of some kind." As they examined the stone, Lucas noticed something strange. When he held it at certain angles, some of the carvings seemed to align perfectly with the patterns on the chamber walls. It was like the stone was meant to be read in conjunction with the room itself. "Hold it up to that section," Emily said, pointing to a particularly complex set of wall carvings. When Lucas did, the patterns overlapped in a way that created new symbols that matched some of the mysterious drawings in Fleming's notebooks. "It's a key to something bigger," Dad said, taking pictures from different angles. Fleming wasn't just hiding artifacts, he was hiding information. The stone is like a decoder or a guide. They spent hours in the chamber, documenting how the keystone interacted with different wall sections. Each new alignment revealed more patterns, more connections. The stone wasn't just an artifact, it was a tool, carefully designed to unlock the meaning behind all of Fleming's discoveries. "Some of these new patterns look like landmarks," Mom said, comparing them to maps in the notebooks. "See how this one matches the ridge line behind our property? And this could be the old creek bed that runs through the woods." Lucas felt the weight of history in his hands as he held the keystone. Fleming had trusted that someday, someone would find this place, understand his clues, and continue his work. Now, over 100 years later, they were holding the key to all his secrets. "We need to decide what to do next," Dad said as they carefully wrapped the stone in clean cloth. "Fleming kept all this hidden for a reason. We need to be just as careful with it as he was." They gathered their equipment and prepared to climb back up. The chamber felt different now, not just a secret room anymore, but the beginning of something much bigger. The keystone in Lucas's backpack seemed to pulse with possibility, carrying the weight of questions that had waited generations to be answered. As they emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, Lucas knew their real adventure was just beginning. Fleming had left them more than just artifacts and puzzles. He'd left them a mission. Whatever truth he discovered, whatever he'd worked so hard to protect, it was their responsibility now. That evening, the family sat around their kitchen table, the keystone wrapped carefully in cloth between them. Empty pizza boxes sat forgotten on the counter. Nobody had wanted to stop long enough to cook dinner. Fleming's notebooks covered every available surface, open to pages they thought might help them understand their next steps. "We could contact the university," Mom suggested, but her tone made it clear she wasn't entirely convinced. "They have experts who deal with historical discoveries." Fleming tried that route, Emily reminded them, pointing to one of his later journal entries. They dismissed him, called him a fraud. What if they just lock everything away in some basement and never really study it? Lucas couldn't take his eyes off the wrapped keystone. Every time they moved the cloth, those strange carvings seemed to catch the light differently. Fleming wanted someone to find this stuff, but he didn't want just anyone. He made it hard to find for a reason. Dad ran his hands through his hair, something he always did when he was thinking hard. Whatever Fleming discovered, it was big enough that he spent years hiding it. "We need to understand why before we tell anyone else." They decided to keep the discovery to themselves, at least until they could figure out more about what Fleming had found. The keystone was clearly meant to guide them somewhere, and they had all his notes to help them understand it. The next morning, they gathered their gear for an expedition into the woods behind their property. The keystone's patterns, when lined up with Fleming's maps, pointed to a specific area they'd never really explored before. It was further back than they usually went, in a part of the forest that had grown wild and thick over the years. "Fleming's maps show this whole area differently," Emily said as they walked, comparing their phone's GPS to the old drawings. "Like there used to be more open spaces, maybe even buildings." Lucas carried the keystone in his backpack, wrapped carefully in layers of soft cloth. Every so often they'd stop to check its markings against landmarks they passed. It was slow going. The undergrowth was thick, and they had to constantly check their direction against both modern tools and Fleming's notes. After about an hour of hiking, they came to a small clearing that made them all stop in their tracks. At first glance, it looked natural, just a space where trees hadn't grown as thickly. But as they looked closer, they could see hints of straight lines under the moss and fallen leaves, places where the ground wasn't quite random in its shapes. "This is it," Dad said, pulling out Fleming's notebook and comparing it to their surroundings. "The trees have grown in, but these are the same rock formations he drew. This used to be a much bigger clearing." They spread out carefully, looking for anything unusual. Emily found the first piece of pottery, half buried under decades of fallen leaves. It was clearly old, with faded designs that didn't look like anything they recognized from local history museums. Lucas remembered Fleming's notes about proper alignment and took out the keystone. Standing in the center of the clearing, he held it up against the horizon line just as the notes suggested. The patterns on the stone suddenly seemed to match the lay of the land perfectly, with certain lines pointing to specific spots around the clearing. "Over here," Mom called from near the edge of the space. She'd brushed away some moss to reveal what looked like carved stone, weathered by time, but still showing clear signs of human workmanship. The designs matched some of the symbols from the underground chamber. As they cleared more areas, they found more evidence. Old stone foundations, broken pieces of pottery, and what looked like the remains of ancient tools. Everything was half buried, hidden by time and nature, but once they knew what to look for, they could see signs of an entire settlement. "This is what Fleming was protecting," Dad said, carefully photographing everything they uncovered. Not just artifacts, but proof of a whole community that existed here long before anyone thought possible. They worked until the sun started to get low, carefully documenting everything but leaving it all in place. Fleming's notebooks had been clear about the importance of preserving sites exactly as they were found. They marked the location on their GPS and made detailed notes about everything they'd seen. Walking back home in the fading light, Lucas felt different. They'd found something real, something important. Fleming hadn't been crazy or making things up. He discovered evidence of a history that had been forgotten by everyone else. "We need help," Mom said as they reached their backyard. "Professional help from someone we can trust." Fleming wanted this found, but he wanted it handled the right way. They all knew she was right. This was bigger than just their family now. Whatever Fleming had discovered, whatever he'd worked so hard to protect, it deserved to be studied and understood properly. But they also knew they needed to be careful about how they shared it with the world. After much discussion around the kitchen table, they decided to contact Dr. Eliza Porter, a local historian Mom knew from her work at the library. Unlike the scholars who had dismissed Fleming's work in the past, Dr. Porter was known for her open mind and careful approach to unusual discoveries. She gave a lecture last year about forgotten historical sites in our area, Mom explained as she dialed the number. She actually mentioned Fleming as someone who might have been unfairly dismissed by the academic community. Dr. Porter arrived the next morning, her eyes widening as they showed her the notebooks, the keystone, and their photographs of the underground chamber. She handled everything with careful reverence, taking notes and occasionally muttering excited comments under her breath. "This is extraordinary," she said finally, looking up from a particularly detailed map. Fleming wasn't just a collector. He was documenting an entire lost civilization. These artifacts, these symbols, they're unlike anything previously discovered in this region. Lucas watched nervously as she examined the keystone, worried she might dismiss it like the historians of Fleming's time. But Dr. Porter treated it with the same care they had, studying how the patterns aligned with the wall carvings in their photos. "The craftsmanship is incredible," she said, tracing one of the spiraling patterns with her finger. "This wasn't just decorative, it's a sophisticated system of recording information. Fleming must have spent years learning to decode it." She agreed to help them document and study everything properly, but also understood their desire to keep the discovery controlled. "Fleming was right to be cautious," she explained. "Sometimes the academic world can be too quick to dismiss things that don't fit with established theories." We need to study this thoroughly before going public. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Porter brought in a small team of trusted experts, archaeologists, linguists, and historians who could help piece together the story Fleming had discovered. They worked carefully, documenting everything and cross-referencing it with historical records from the area. The clearing in the woods turned out to be even more significant than they'd first thought. As the archaeologists carefully excavated the site, they uncovered evidence of sophisticated construction techniques and tools that shouldn't have existed in this part of the world during that time period. These people had knowledge and capabilities we never knew about, Dr. Porter explained to Lucas and Emily as they watched the excavation. Fleming didn't just find artifacts. He found evidence that could change our understanding of early human civilization in this region. The team worked methodically, treating every discovery with care and respect. They found more pottery pieces with intricate designs, tools made from materials that must have come from hundreds of miles away, and stone tablets covered in the same writing system they'd seen in the underground chamber. Lucas and Emily were included in every step of the process. Dr. Porter insisted that as the original discoverers, they had earned the right to be part of the research team. They learned how to properly clean and catalog artifacts, how to document excavation sites, and how to use special cameras to photograph the findings. Fleming would have loved this, Emily said one afternoon as they watched a linguist work on translating some of the symbols. Real scientists taking his discovery seriously, trying to understand what he found. The story finally went public in a carefully managed way. Dr. Porter helped arrange a special exhibit at the local museum, featuring the artifacts they'd found along with Fleming's notebooks and photographs. The keystone was given a place of honor, displayed in a way that showed how its patterns aligned with the other discoveries. The exhibit opening drew people from all over the region. Lucas stood with his family near the entrance, watching as visitors examined the displays with wonder and excitement. Hearing them talk about Fleming's discoveries, seeing them lean in close to study the artifacts, made him feel proud of how they'd handled everything. "We did it right," Dad said, putting his hand on Lucas's shoulder. "We honored Fleming's work and made sure his discoveries were properly understood." Dr. Porter had already started planning future excavations in the area, guided by the clues in Fleming's notebooks. The keystone's patterns had helped them identify other potential sites, suggesting that what they'd found might just be the beginning of a much bigger discovery. Lucas often thought about that first moment when his shovel hit the metal handle of the hatch. One ordinary afternoon had led to something extraordinary, something that would be remembered long after they were gone. Fleming's legacy was finally being recognized, and new chapters of history were being written. The underground chamber remained their special place, though. Sometimes Lucas would go down there just to look at the wall carvings, remembering the excitement of those first discoveries. The air still felt cool and ancient, but now the chamber felt less like a mystery and more like a connection, a bridge between the past and the present that he and his family had helped build. The museum exhibit became something much bigger than anyone had expected. Schools started organizing field trips to see it, and researchers from universities across the country came to study the artifacts. Lucas and Emily found themselves giving tours to kids their own age, explaining how they'd first discovered the hatch and what it felt like to uncover Fleming's secrets. The best part, Lucas told a group of wide-eyed fourth graders, was realizing that this amazing discovery had been right in our backyard the whole time. Fleming left all these clues, just waiting for someone to find them. The keystone drew the most attention. People were fascinated by how its patterns seemed to change depending on how you looked at it, and how it connected to the other artifacts. Dr. Porter had set up a special display that showed how the stone's markings aligned with maps of the area, revealing the locations of other potential sites. Emily had started taking archaeology classes after school, learning proper excavation techniques from the professionals working at the site. She'd even begun cataloging some of her own finds, carefully documenting everything just like Fleming had done in his notebooks. "It's like solving a puzzle that's been waiting 100 years to be solved," she explained to a reporter who came to do a story about their discovery. "Every new thing we find helps us understand more about the people who lived here before." Their parents watched all of this with a mix of pride and amazement. The quiet family home had become a hub of historical research, with experts often gathering in their kitchen to discuss new findings over coffee and Mom's homemade cookies. The backyard, once just a place for weekend gardening and games, was now recognized as an important historical site. More discoveries came as the research continued. Dr. Porter's team found evidence of trading networks that stretched across the continent, suggesting that the ancient settlement had been part of something much larger. The symbols they'd first seen in the underground chamber turned out to be part of a complex writing system that predated any other known scripts in the region. Lucas started spending his free time helping to digitize Fleming's notebooks, carefully scanning each page and helping to transcribe the faded handwriting. As he worked, he felt like he was getting to know Fleming better, understanding the excitement and frustration the explorer must have felt as he worked to document his discoveries. He knew people weren't ready to understand what he'd found, Lucas said one evening as he worked on the digital archive. But he never gave up. He just found a different way to share it by leaving everything for someone else to find when the time was right. The original underground chamber was eventually opened to small, guided tours, though the family insisted on maintaining strict preservation measures. Each visitor had to wear special protective gear, and photography was limited to prevent damage from flash exposure. But standing in that cool, dark space, looking at the ancient symbols on the walls, people could feel the same sense of wonder that Lucas and Emily had felt on that first day. As winter approached, Dr. Porter's team finished their initial excavation of the clearing in the woods. They'd uncovered the foundations of several structures, along with hundreds of artifacts that helped tell the story of the people who had lived there. Each piece added to their understanding of a civilization that had been nearly lost to time. One crisp afternoon, Lucas stood at the edge of the excavation site, watching as the sun set behind the trees. Emily joined him, clutching a hot chocolate their mom had brought out to the research team. "Sometimes I still can't believe all this started because you were looking for worms," she said, bumping his shoulder playfully. Lucas grinned. Fleming must have known someone would find it eventually. He left too many clues for it to stay hidden forever. The sound of excited voices drew their attention back to the site, where one of the archaeologists was carefully brushing dirt away from a new find. That was happening more often now. Each day seemed to bring some new piece of the puzzle, another fragment of the story Fleming had worked so hard to preserve. As they walked back home through the gathering dusk, Lucas thought about how much had changed since that ordinary Saturday afternoon when his shovel had hit something unexpected. Their backyard wasn't just a backyard anymore. It was part of something bigger, something that would outlast all of them. Fleming's legacy had finally found its moment, and Lucas knew they'd done right by the old explorer's trust. The mystery he'd protected for so long was now being shared with the world, not as a sensation or a controversy, but as a carefully studied piece of history that would help people understand the past in new ways. The hatch that had started it all remained, a simple metal handle in the earth that had opened up not just an underground chamber, but a door to the past itself. And somewhere, Lucas liked to think, Theodore Fleming was smiling, knowing his century-old secret had finally found its way into the right hands.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.